All right, thank you for joining us today for Why Country Isn't CHR, what listener streaming and buying behavior can teach us about consumption of new country music. My name is Matt Bailey. I'm the president here at Integr8 Research, and if you're asking yourself, who are you guys? I haven't heard of Integr8 Research before. Well, our company is new, so that's why you may not have heard of us, but we stem from a 30-year heritage of helping radio stations pick the right new music. We trace our roots back to Core Callout, which got started back in the mid-1980s when Callout Research was relatively new, and their claim to fame was focusing on those listeners that had the greatest impact on a station's ratings for research. In 2009, we became part of Coleman Insights back when we were all grappling with the fact that simply relying on landline telephone calls to do music research was not a reliable sample anymore. And Coleman Insights then took it to the next level, launching Integrate New Music Research, which uses a multi-methodological approach to finding stations listeners. And then in 2016, we became our own company, so that we can focus exclusively on helping radio pick the right new music. So that's a brief background on us. Bit of housekeeping. If you have a question as the presentation goes along the way, we're going to tackle those at the end. So at any point in this presentation, simply go into your webinar chat menu. My colleague Katie Dombrowski will be gathering those questions throughout the webinar, and then we can answer them together at the end. Should be about 24-25 minutes with you before we get to the questions. So country radio has a long tradition of tapping CHR programmers to bring their skills into the country format. And even if you're a veteran country programmer, a lot of times veteran country programmers also look to their colleagues in CHR to see what they can steal in order to make their country stations as good as they can be. Well, if you're one of those CHR programmers who's recently made the move to country, or if you're simply one of those country programmers looking to have the freshest sound possible, when it comes to your new music, some of the questions you might be asking about comparing CHR to country are questions like, can I make our station sound hotter by being more aggressive with new releases than the other stations in town? Should I move powers to recurrence at the same time that I did in CHR? Will getting rid of the recurrence help our new country image and make our station sound fresher? And finally, a best-selling debut means that a song is going to be a huge hit for country radio, right? Well, these are all questions about how new, or how old, depending on your perspective, are the biggest country hits. How quickly do country listeners embrace, get to know, fall in love with new music, and how long is it before they get tired of hearing new music? To answer this question, we're going to look at various ways that country fans consume new music by utilizing the Billboard charts, which are powered by Nielsen in many regards. One of the charts we're going to look at is the Country Streaming Songs chart, which is video and audio streaming of country music on services such as Spotify and YouTube, as well as some of the smaller services such as Slacker. And the reason we're going to examine the Country Streaming Songs chart is because we want to see what songs listeners are playing for themselves when they're in control of their own music, when they're picking out the songs for themselves on Spotify and YouTube. We're then going to compare that to the Country Airplay chart, which is radio airplay audience impressions, so that we can see how are the songs that we in country radio are playing for our listeners the same or different than the songs that they're playing for themselves on Spotify and YouTube. We'll also take a look at Country Digital Songs chart, which is simply a fancy way of saying the paid single downloads on services such as iTunes. So we're going to take a look at what people are actually putting down their hard-earned money to buy and how that compares to Airplay and streaming. And finally, we'll bring in some additional insights from a panel of selected country stations who use our own Integrate New Music Research service. So before we show you the numbers, to get really nitpicky on what we're examining exactly so you understand the methodology here, we're going to examine the top 10 songs on the Billboard charts from March 28th, 2015 through September 19th, 2015. So we're going back to last year and we're looking at 26 weeks of the biggest hits. We've calibrated each of those top 10 songs song vintage, in other words, how old or how new the song is. We've calibrated song vintage to when each song first entered any of the following Billboard charts: the Hot Country Songs chart, the Country Airplay chart, the Country Digital Songs chart, which remember is paid digital singles downloads, and the Country Streaming Songs chart. So the reason we're using this, in other words, not when it entered the top 10, but when it entered the bottom of any of those charts, is because we want to measure when each song first became into the consciousness of the country music fan base. In other words, when do people start noticing this song? And the reason we're using that as our metric for how old a song is, as opposed to, say, the first date it appeared in media base or the CD release date, is because, well, if you're the third single from a popular CD, it may be 8 or 9 or 10 months before anyone notices that third single from the album, compared to when the album was released. So by doing this, we're measuring when people first noticed the song for its song vintage, not when the record company released the album that it's on. And finally, we're also going to look at the top 10 songs for a panel of selected Country Integrate new music research clients during the same period. So for our point of reference, since we're talking about why country isn't CHR, first we need to get a baseline for, well, how new or how old are the biggest hits in the CHR universe? Back when we were still a part of Coleman Insights last year, we did a groundbreaking study called When is a Hit a Hit? And that study is still on Coleman Insights website, I believe. And we basically did some of the same things we're going to do today for country when we looked at those things for CHR. So just to give you a baseline of how things are in the CHR universe when it comes to how listeners consume new music. In the CHR universe, 55% of the top 10 most streamed songs are between 9 and 24 weeks old. In the CHR universe, in radio airplay, 53% of the top 10 most played songs on the radio in the CHR universe are between 9 and 20 weeks old. So both in streaming and in radio airplay and CHR, we see that the typical song needs about 9 weeks to work its way up to the top 10. Since we're also going to look at single sales, this is the curve in the CHR universe for the top 10 most purchased songs on services such as iTunes, and it's a completely different curve. Instead of growing, building, and declining in the CHR universe, single sales start off strong and then decay every week thereafter, so that 55% of all of the top 10 most purchased digital singles are between 1 and 12 weeks old. So just as airplay and streaming are peaking, that's when sales, new people buying the songs on iTunes are declining. Now we're going to get rid of sales for a minute. We'll come back to that because right now we're going to focus on the songs that people are actually listening to. And one way of thinking about the vintage of the hottest hits in the CHR universe based on streaming and airplay is that in both streaming and airplay, only 21% of the most streamed songs and most played songs on the radio in the CHR world are 28 weeks old or older. So in CHR, 4 out of 5 songs are already past their prime as a hit once they hit 28 weeks. So that's our baseline for our comparison to country. How new are the country songs listeners stream most? Let's take a look first at what listeners are playing for themselves on services such as Spotify and YouTube. Well, here again is our CHR distribution curve of how old the songs are that CHR listeners are streaming most. 55% of the top 10 most streamed CHR songs are between 9 and 24 weeks old. Well, here's what that looks like in the country universe. You'll notice that it's a slower distribution curve. Songs are taking longer to become top 10 hits, and they're staying around longer once they do. In comparison, 55% of the top 10 most streamed country songs are between 13 and 36 weeks old. So compared to CHR, when it comes to streaming, we're seeing that listeners are taking about a month longer than they are in the CHR world for songs to move up to become a top 10 most streamed song. And then once they do, they're sticking around for, in some cases, 3 months longer on the streaming songs chart. Another way of comparing this data is for those songs that after most songs have already peaked and fallen, how many songs hang around for an unusually long period of time? Well, in the CHR world, only 5% of all top 10 most streamed CHR songs are older than 45 weeks. But in country, 23% of the top 10 most streamed country songs are older than 45 weeks. So a significantly larger share of the top 10 most streamed songs are songs that are sticking around week after week, month after month, and in some cases well past 1 year since listeners first noticed them. Now, what are some of these songs that fall in that sweet spot of the top 10 most streamed country songs between 13 and 36 weeks, the songs that follow the typical pattern that we're talking about here? Well, the songs that were top 10 most streamed country songs between 13 and 36 weeks are some of 2015's biggest country hits. Songs like Eric Church's Like a Wrecking Ball, Blake Shelton's Sangria, and Chris Jansen's Buy Me a Boat. Now, there are some songs that are unusual in that they became hits faster than 13 weeks. They became top 10 hits faster than 13 weeks. Not all of them stayed that way. Airplay. One of them, Steven Tyler's Love Is Your Name. I think people streamed that early on just for the novelty of hearing Aerosmith's frontman do country. But the rest of them were pretty bona fide country hits. Songs like Maddie and Tay's Fly, Luke Bryan's Kick That Dust Up, and Luke Bryan's Strip It Down. These were all songs that became hits faster than average. They became top 10 on the country streaming songs chart faster than 13 weeks. Now let's take a look at those songs that hung around an unusually long period of time. Those songs that stayed top 10 on the country streaming songs chart for 45 weeks or longer. Well, one of the songs we're going to ignore for the rest of this presentation, and let's explain what it is and why. Florida Georgia Line's Cruise remained a top 10 most streamed song on the country streaming chart for almost 2 years, but we're going to ignore it for two reasons. One, Florida Georgia Line's Cruise also had a version, as you remember, with Nelly that crossed over beyond country, and we can't parse out which of those streams are from real country fans and which of those streams were from fans of other formats who were streaming the Nelly version. So for that reason, we're going to ignore it. But even without the crossover effect, Florida Georgia Line's Cruise was a bigger chart performer than any song since a Buck Owens song in 1963. So since that's such a massive hit, we don't want it skewing our data, so we're going to ignore Florida Georgia Line's Cruise for the rest of this presentation. But the rest of those songs are some pretty huge hits. Sam Hunt's Take Your Time, Luke Bryan's Play It Again, Florida Georgia Line and Luke Bryan's This Is How We Roll, and Brantley Gilbert Bottoms Up all stayed top 10 on country streaming chart for 45 or more weeks, in some cases well past 45 weeks. Now let's flip over and look at Airplay. How new are the country songs listeners hear on country radio, and how does that compare with CHR? Well, as a reminder, this is how old these songs are that CHR radio plays most. 53% of the top 10 most played songs on CHR radio are between 9 and 20 weeks old. Well, just as we saw in streaming, country is a little bit slower. 54% of the top 10 most played songs on country radio are between 13 and 28 weeks old. So just as we saw in streaming, country fans are taking about 4 weeks longer to push songs up to the top 10 in radio exposure as they are on streaming. So those things are the same. And songs are staying around longer. How much longer? Well, one way of looking at it is that 26% of all top 10 most played songs on CHR radio are 25 weeks old or older. So at 25 weeks, about 3/4 of songs have already run their course. But in country, 45% of the top 10 most played songs on country radio are 25 weeks old or older. So not only songs taking longer to warm up, but they're sticking around longer. Now the real question we want to answer by looking at these two things, though, is how does country airplay compare to streaming? Before we get there, I'm going to show you some of those songs that remained huge hits on country radio for a longer than average time, and I'll tell you why later in this presentation, but remember some of these songs. Those songs that stayed top 10 on country airplay chart for 36 weeks or longer include Brantley Gilbert's One Hell of an Amen, Kelsey Ballerini's Love Me Like You Mean It, Easton Corbin's Baby Be My Love Song, and Kanan Smith's Love You Like That. Remember those songs because we're going to see those again later in this presentation. Now, what we're really interested in here is from looking at what listeners play for themselves when they're in control of their own music, how does that vary from what we as radio programmers are offering them on country radio? Well, here's our country airplay distribution chart of showing how old the songs are that country radio plays most. And we'll bring back in our country streaming songs chart to look at how new or how old the songs are that country fans are playing for themselves on Spotify and YouTube. And you'll notice that from week 1 to week 44, the curves look very similar. It takes about 13 weeks for songs to work their way up to the top 10 on average, and then we see that songs are, if they haven't already, are declining between week 36 and week 44. It's when we get to week 45 that radio airplay and streaming behavior diverge. To quantify it, 18% of the top 10 most streamed country songs are 45 weeks old or older, and that's once we've gotten rid of Florida Georgia Line's Cruise. But in comparison, only 2% of the top 10 most played songs on country radio are 45 weeks old or older. So that begs the question, is country radio making a mistake? Are we moving songs out of current categories faster than listeners are ready for us to do so if they're still streaming them with such frequency? Well, we at Integr8 Research believe that no, country radio is not making a mistake, and here's why. let's bring back in those songs that were among the songs that listeners kept in the top 10 most streamed country songs for well past 45 weeks. They were songs like Sam Hunt's Take Your Time, Luke Bryan's Play It Again, Florida Georgia Line, and Luke Bryan's This Is How We Roll, and Brantley Gilbert's Bottoms Up, all huge hits. Well, not only are people streaming them a lot for a long period of time, but Integr8 Research for our country clients also showed that when listeners were asked how much they love these songs, they still love these songs for a long time too. When we examine popularity, how much listeners love these songs, Sam Hunt's Take Your Time was still #1 at 45 weeks, and it remains so for many more weeks to come. Luke Bryan's Play It Again was the #2 song as long as 60 weeks. This Is How We Roll was still #1 at 66 weeks, and Bottoms Up was still #1 at 77 weeks. So clearly, listeners still love these songs. But new music research brings in an additional dimension to gauging songs' popularity, and that is how many listeners are tired of hearing these songs. Maybe they still love them, but they'll also tell you that, you know what, I don't want to hear it as often as I used to. We call this burn, of course. And when we examined burn for these songs, we found that Sam Hunt's Take Your Time at 45 weeks was the #6 most burned song among our country clients. Luke Bryan's Play It Again was the #1 most burned song at 60 weeks. This Is How We Roll was the #3 most burned song, and Brantley Gilbert's Bottoms Up was the #5 most burned song among 77 weeks. So, you know, what do you call a song that people are telling you that they still love, but they've gotten sick of hearing and they don't want to hear it as often as they used to want to hear it? Well, you call those songs recurrence. And the songs that stay top 10 in streaming after 45 weeks, those songs are country radio's power recurrence. So that's why we believe radio is making the right move by moving those songs to power recurrent categories, but not keeping them in power current categories. Now let's take a look at what listeners are buying. How new are the country songs that listeners are buying, and what can we as radio programmers learn from that behavior? Well, as a reminder, this is what CHR song sales look like. 55% of all top our digital single sales are between 1 and 12 weeks old. And just as a reminder, these are single songs that people are buying on services such as iTunes. We're not looking at physical CD sales here, and we're not looking at people who download an entire album. We're just looking at people who buy a single song on services like iTunes. When we compare that to what country single digital sales look like, we see that the curve is fundamentally different in 2 ways. First off, as we've seen elsewhere, it's slower, it takes longer to build, and things stick around longer. But there's also another difference. You'll notice when you look at CHR sales that songs are really big in the first week and then decline every week thereafter. You do see a bump in the first week for debuts, and we're going to come back and talk about that. But unlike CHR, you see that songs are building, during the 8-week mark. Songs continue to keep building in terms of their sales figures. So the result is that 54% of the top 10 country digital single sales are between 9 and 24 weeks old. That's a fundamentally different curve than you see in the CHR universe. Now let's look at those songs that do debut as a top 10 best-selling single. You might be asking yourself, if a song debuts as a top 10 bestseller, that must be an indicator that the song is going to be a huge hit on country radio, and I had to be all over it as a programmer, right? Well, you'll find plenty of examples to validate that theory. Songs like Luke Bryan, Kick That Dust Up, Luke Bryan's Strip It Down, Chris Jansen's Buy Me a Boat, and Keith Urban's John Cougar, John Deere, John 316. All of those songs debuted as top 10 bestsellers. But you'll also find some examples that say maybe that theory isn't such a good one. Songs like Jake Owen's Real Life, a song that I think the record company thought ought to be a hit, but really kind of fizzled out. Songs like George Strait's Let It Go. Obviously, George Strait is a legend. Anything he releases is going to be something that his fans are going to want to buy. But with all apologies to King George, he simply isn't as relevant to contemporary country stations as he was 20 years ago. Believe it or not, somebody actually paid to buy Steven Tyler's Love Is Your Name. Megan Lindsay's Tennessee Whiskey debuted as a top 10 bestseller, no doubt because she was on The Voice. And Casey Musgrave's Biscuits was also debuted as a top 10 bestseller. Casey is one of those artists that has a passionate fan base, but really isn't relevant as a superstar to mainstream country radio. So let's quantify this. If you've got some songs that are debuting as top 10 bestsellers going on to be big hits and some that aren't, how can you tell the difference? And what percentage of those songs that debut as top 10 best-selling singles are likely to go on to be big hits? Well, it turns out Then when you look at the song that debuted top 10 in country digital single sales, 71% of them never reached the top 10 in country airplay. In other words, 71% of those songs that debuted as top 10 bestsellers went on to be stiffs. Only 29% of the songs that debuted top 10 on their very first week in country digital single sales went on to become top 10 in country airplay. So to put it another way, if you simply pick songs that are come out of the chute as bestsellers, the chances are 70% that you're picking a stiff, not a hit. Now in comparison, remember, a lot of country songs actually grow in their sales over week after week. If you look at the songs that took 8 or more weeks to become top 10 in sales, all of them, 100% of them during the time period we evaluated, also became top 10 in country airplay. And that's what happened with songs like Sam Hunt's House Party, Billy Currington's Don't It, Kelsea Ballerini's Love Me Like You Mean It, and Kanan Smith's Love You Like That. These were songs that all slowly built their way up to being top 10 bestsellers. In particular, Don't It and Love Me Like You Mean It are songs that actually became top 10 in country radio airplay before they came top 10 in single sales. Now, we couldn't prove it in court, but our theory is that it's the fact that listeners were hearing these songs on their favorite country stations and getting to know them that actually motivated the song sales. Now, we of course know that radio generates song sales in all formats. This is still true in 2016, but this evidence suggests that there's even a stronger correlation between radio's power to make people love songs and country fans' willingness to go out and buy them than in other formats. And to show this in another way, remember we looked at the songs that radio kept playing week after week after week for a longer than average period of time. Well, when we take a look at the songs that stayed top 10 on the country digital single sales chart for an unusually long period of time, the songs that would stay top 10 for 37 weeks or longer, well, those songs were songs like Sam Hunt's House Party, Little Big Town's Girl Crush, Kelsea Ballerini's Love Me Like You Mean It, Sam Hunt's Take Your Time, and Kanan Smith's Love You Like That. These last three were some of the same songs that we saw that radio kept playing week after week after week, and sure enough, country fans kept buying them week after week as well. So this is something that you can remind your record rep friends when they come to visit you. So we've thrown a lot of information out your way in the last 20 minutes. Let's sum it up by taking a look at the 4 reasons country isn't CHR. Reason number 1, CHR songs typically take 9 weeks to become top 10 hits with listeners. In country, songs typically take 13 weeks to become top 10 hits with listeners. The bottom line is country listeners typically need 4 weeks longer to warm up to new songs than CHR listeners do. Reason number 2, in CHR, big hits typically stay top 10 hits for 20 to 28 weeks before listeners get sick of them, whereas in country, big hits typically stay top 10 hits for 28 to 44 weeks before listeners get sick of them. The bottom line, if you move songs to recurrent in country when you would move them in CHR, you're moving many songs right at their peak, right when listeners are most interested in hearing them. Reason number 3, in CHR, there's a relatively low appetite for hearing recurrence, and by recurrence we mean songs that are 27 weeks old or older. In country, however, there's a moderate appeal, a moderate appetite for hearing recurrence, and by recurrence we typically mean songs that are 45 weeks old or older. Why is that? Well, in CHR, songs capture the moment. If you think about every big song of the summer over the last few years, songs like California Girls and Blurred Lines and Iggy Azalea's Fancy, these were all songs that really defined the summer when they were big hits. But once September rolled around and people got into fall activities, new music research confirmed that by the end of September, people were sick of those songs. They had had enough of them. They were huge in their moment, but that moment had passed. As anyone who's programmed country knows, country songs tell a timeless story. Sure, there are some songs in country radio that come and go and that listeners lose interest in them after they've had their run as a hit, but there are a relatively high number of songs that listeners long emotional connection with those songs. They tell a story that the listeners can relate to, and those stories remain relevant in some cases to their lives for years. So how does this relate to programming your radio station? Well, that's why recurrents play a bigger role in country than they do in CHR. They remain relevant because listeners are connected to those songs emotionally. Finally, our 4th reason that country isn't CHR. In CHR, digital single sales are strongest from week 1 to week 12. Sales are declining right when airplay is peaking. In country, Digital single sales are strongest from 9 to 24 weeks, and we think that different pattern is thanks to exposure on your country radio station. So, final thing here, so what can country take from CHR? If you're the country programmer who wants to steal some tricks from the CHR playbook, or if you're a CHR programmer who's recently been assigned to work programming country and you're really trying to figure out what to keep and what to leave behind, well, playing more brand new songs than your competitor, and by brand new I mean songs that are only a couple of weeks old, well, that's a bad move because the data suggests that country listeners actually need a little longer to warm up to new songs than CHR listeners do. Moving songs out of current categories faster than your competitor, also not a smart move because in country, if you move songs as fast as you would in CHR, that's when listeners are oftentimes most interested in hearing those songs. Dropping popular recurrents in order to sound new, also probably not a good idea because those recurrents that you're dropping in many cases are the songs that listeners feel most strongly and emotionally connected to. They might not want to hear them as often as they did when they were brand new, but they still do want to hear them. There are some things that you can take from CHR though. A short playlist of proven hits, well, that's a winning formula in just about any format. High energy cutting edge imaging, that could be a good idea, or personalities that relate to younger adults. That can also be a winning strategy, especially if you're in a market dynamic where the heritage country station is one that listeners perceive as old or stale or out of touch. Quite a few stations have come in that situation and come in with better, younger, fresher packaging and personalities that were more relatable to adults in their 20s and 30s and won the ratings battle with these strategies. Developing a reputation for new country. This is a winning strategy as well. Here at Integrate New Music Research, we don't do perceptual research, but in all the perceptual studies that we've seen, by and large, it's usually the country station that owns the new music image in the minds of its market listeners that also wins the ratings battle. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, those stations win compared to stations that might own the variety country or the gold country image. But it's important to keep in mind what listeners think of when you say new country. Listeners don't think of new country as songs that are brand new, not songs that are a week or two old that just landed on your desk. They think of it as being songs of this era of country music, which brings in another strategy you can employ. A winning strategy that CHR programmers have used in the country arena: sacrifice the previous generation of country superstars to grow your new country reputation. Yep, that can be a winning strategy too. If you think back to the 90s, back when the new country brand was really taking off, back when Garth Brooks and Clint Black were really popular, those stations were the ones that had the courage to say bye to Alabama and the Judds and Randy Travis, the previous generation of country superstars, in order so that they can gain greater imagery for the Garth Brooks of the early 90s. Fast forward a decade, and it was the stations that were willing to say goodbye to Garth Brooks and Shania Twain that were able to get imagery for playing the new generation of country music from artists like Keith Urban and Brad Paisley. You know, today we have stations focusing on artists like Sam Hunt and Luke Bryan and Blake Shelton and Jason Aldean that are willing to cut ties with the previous decade. So that could be a winning strategy for you too. Well, that sums up why country isn't CHR, and if you have questions that you haven't typed out yet, you can do that now, and my colleague Katie will pass them along to me. Katie, do we have any questions so far?
Yes, we have a couple questions. Thanks, Matt, for such a great presentation. The first question that we had was, you said that people don't want to hear songs as often after they're 45 weeks old. But if they're still top 10 in streaming, doesn't that mean they do still want to hear them a lot?
That's a really valid question, and in order to answer that, it's important to understand why radio listening is different from streaming behavior. In streaming, haters don't hurt you. And the reason for that, and by streaming I mean here on demand, where people are picking their own songs on services like Spotify and YouTube. When listeners are in control of their own music, if they don't like a song or they are not in the mood to hear a song anymore, they simply stop playing it on Spotify or on YouTube, and that doesn't hurt you. In radio, however, if you play a song that listeners either don't like anymore, never did like, or simply don't want to hear as often as you used to play it, listeners will actually change stations on you. And so that's why in radio, haters can hurt you. And even though we find that there's a lot of value in looking at streaming data alongside other metrics, that's where you have to be careful, because you know, if you have a song that's polarizing, you'll see that factor. For example, Girl Crush was one of those songs that did really well in sales and really well in streaming, but when radio tested it, they found out that a lot that was kind of polarizing. You know, both because of the controversy surrounding it that was, what it was, and some of it just because it was that kind of song. The radio stations found that, there was a significant portion of their audience that just didn't want to hear that song. Well, that didn't show up in streaming because there was enough people who did want to hear that song. So, any other questions?
Yes, there are a few more. One person asked, when you're talking about this, what about rotations? In looking at this, should we maybe play hot recurrents more often than currents? And how much gold should be played compared to currents and recurrents as part of the same question?
It would probably be inappropriate for me to sort of give carte blanche advice for every country station in every market and every competitive situation about how they should manage their rotations. Every competitive situation is going to be different, and I think that really that kind of comes down to what your market is interested in hearing, what your competitor is doing. So I feel it would be inappropriate for me to try to put down some edict about what the rotations for every country station in the United States. I will say that one mistake that I do see stations making a lot of times is trying to hedge their bet on new songs and saying, you know what, I've got all these great songs on my desk, I'm not sure which one's going to be a hit, so I'm going to play those in really low rotations and see which ones break out. The problem with that strategy for brand new material is that if listeners don't hear them often enough, they don't even remember the last time they heard them. So what happens is, it's like you never get the song around the bases. It can barely get onto first base in terms of listeners becoming aware of it, knowing it, and getting to like it. So I would encourage, again, depending on your individual situation, be highly selective with the new songs that you're going to add to the station, that you're going to take a risk on, and then give them enough exposure so that listeners can get to know them quickly. And if you're going to fail on a new song that your audience is going to reject, it's better to fail fast and then move on to something else than it is to keep a whole bunch of songs in low-level rotations that listeners don't know, that they're never going to be able to hear them often enough to give you honest feedback on them.
All right. Thank you for that answer. We have another question. Should all songs remain current for 45 weeks?
No. And again, we're looking at sort of things at a macro level, at a 30,000-foot level, to sort of see the patterns in how listeners consume music. But the reality is, when you drill down to individual songs, there are some songs that end up being top 10 hits that listeners are done with at 19 and 20 weeks. There are other songs, though, that listeners still want to hear at 45 weeks. So in an ideal scenario, if you're in a situation where it makes sense for you, you can have custom research to tell you what's going on with your audience. If you don't have that, you'll want to look at other tools. You want to look obviously at what other stations that you respect and that are relevant to you are playing. You want to look at streaming behavior. You want to look at sales data and try to get a sense of which songs are ones that listeners really do want to still hear for 44 or 45 weeks, and which songs are ones that, they were big, but after 25, 28, 30 weeks, listeners are ready to move on, because every song is different.
Okay, great. We had some requests that you go back over the number 4 reason for why you had the comparisons, the 4 reasons why country, the CHR. I think that they wanted to go back over the 4th.
So what we were basically talking about in that 4th one was how the songs that CHR fans are the singles that people pay to buy on iTunes are different for CHR fans, and the singles that people pay to buy on iTunes are for country fans. And the big difference really was that in CHR, songs come out with huge sales and then decline. You don't see as many songs growing in sales week over week. And so you see that the top 10 most paid for songs on services like iTunes in the CHR universe is 1 to 12 weeks, but in country you see songs building on average over 9 weeks and then sticking around for about 24 weeks. And our big conclusion where there basically is that we think there's a far more significant interplay between country radio generating sales than there are in other formats. Now, don't get me wrong, radio generates record sales in all formats, but in country that relationship looks to be even stronger based on looking at how sales data compares to country radio airplay. Basically, the bottom line from that 4th slide there was, have confidence that you're helping sell records.
Right. Can you put that fourth slide up? There's a couple of people actually asked to see it again.
Oh yeah, we can do that.
So while you're pulling that up, going back to the question about 45 weeks, are the songs that take 45 weeks mostly from new artists?
They're not from brand new artists per se. I will say that they generally tend to be from artists that define the current generation of country music. They're artists like Sam Hunt. They're artists like Florida Georgia Line. They're the artists that, you know, really are, if someone were going to ask you, you know, hey, who are the hottest country stars of this generation of country, tend to be those stars, you know, Luke Bryan, those type of folks. You know, they're not necessarily like, they are artists though that are generally established artists.
Okay, okay. We have one more question, and it's about the comparison of CHR versus country. Is it just a question of different power rotation?
Okay, so this is a question, I'm going to go back here.
No, it says quicker exposure means faster burn.
Right, so in other words, this is a question of like, you know, you're looking at some CHR stations which might be playing their power currents, you know, 80 times, 90 times, and for some rhythmic CHRs, 120 times a week, whereas country usually doesn't spin their songs that fast. I'm assuming this is a question about should we be spinning our songs as fast as CHR. Again, I would feel uncomfortable giving any radio station specific advice to apply carte blanche to everybody in all of North America. But one thing I will say is that country radio tends to have a higher TSL, time spent listening, than CHR stations do. And so therefore, when a CHR station is playing a song 90, 100, 120 times a week, their listeners are tuning in for shorter periods of time, so that it takes more spins in order for a listener to hear a song the same number of times per week. Country is blessed with really loyal listeners who generally generate more TSL, so you don't need quite as many spins each week in order for your typical P1 listener to hear the song the same number of times per week as a CHR station would require. So again, there may be individual situations where it makes sense, but most country stations don't need to be spinning their songs with quite the frequency that a CHR would because of the higher TSL.
Okay, well, thank you. That does it for the questions that have been sent in. You know, before you close things out, I'd just like to remind everyone we are recording this, so hopefully we'll have it up on the Integr8 website by the end of the week.
And if you would like to ask a question that you forgot about later, my email is mattbailey@integrate8research.com. Feel free to email me, and I will do my best to answer your question for you when you're ready.